February 26, 1916. In the Malancourt Forest, near the Verdun Fortress, French soldiers of the 362nd Infantry Regiment huddled in their trenches. A strange screeching sound came from the German trench. "What the hell is that?" A French soldier. They weren't launching massive sweeps. A stream of thick black liquid spurted from the hose, and in an instant, it transformed into a gigantic column of fire. More than 20. The French soldiers on the front lines didn't have time to fire a single shot. This wasn't war. This was God's punishment. This was the first time the world witnessed the destructive power of the Flammenwerfer, the flamethrower. Entered the ambush zone set up by the Australians. Welcome to brutal World War. To understand why this weapon was created, we must go back in time a little. At the beginning of the 20th century, the German Empire and the man behind. In 1901, a special unit was formed. Top secret. They didn't belong to the regular infantry. They were the pioneer, the vanguard engineering force. The symbol on they were selected from the best firefighters, the best mechanics. Its construction was simple, but deadly. A container of kerosene mixed with asphalt for viscosity. A container of compressed nitrogen gas for pressure. And an ignition device at the nozzle. Intelligence. When the trigger was pulled, the compressed gas pushed the oil out, through the fuse, and boom! A fire dragon. 18 to 20 meters long. The Germans proudly called them the Knights, the Knights of Fire. They believed that with this weapon, no army in the world could stand. And back to the Malancourt Forest. The appearance of flamethrowers didn't just inflict physical damage. It struck directly at humanity's most primal fears, the fear of being eaten alive, and the fear of being burned alive. Why could a force patrolling with... In military history, soldiers could accept being hit by bullets. It was a quick death. General William Westmoreland, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, believed in attrition warfare. He believed that if American soldiers killed more enemy soldiers than the enemy could replace, America would win. The only measure of success was body count. The liquid fire flowed down the trenches like a flood. It seeped into every nook and cranny, into every bunker. The burning oil clung to their clothes, to their skin. The French soldiers tried to put out the fire by rolling on the ground, but to no avail. This fire was specially formulated. The psychological effect was devastating. In just a few hours, a well-trained French regiment was completely annihilated. The German report that day recorded a chilling line. The enemy offered no resistance. They were paralyzed by fear. Attackers had vanished like ghosts. The Americans marched to fight, but behind the initial glory of victory, most of Australia's senior commanders and non-commissioned officers had just spent 10 years fighting communist insurgents in the dense jungles of Malaysia, the Malayan Emergency. They had learned a hard lesson. In the jungle, noise is deadly. The Australian doctrine wasn't search and destroy. It was counterinsurgency. While the Americans wanted big battles, the Australians wanted control. They believed you don't win by killing everyone. You win by separating the enemy from the population. You win by dominating the jungle, not burning it down. Just one bullet. A bullet that pierced the thin steel casing of the compressed nitrogen tank, or the oil, and the result was a horrific explosion. The flamethrower didn't die alone. He exploded, becoming a giant fireball. The initial pride gradually turned into fear. Other German infantrymen began to avoid the flamethrowers. They didn't want to go near these mobile The attacks at Malancourt and Verdun were the pinnacle of... When a unit of American soldiers marches by, you can hear them from miles away. The French and British didn't keep running away. They began giving orders to the snipers. Don't shoot at the head. Shoot at the barrel on the back. There are records of an Australian, and they began developing new tactics to hunt down these hunters in return. Germany's proud weapon was about to. They use mosquito repellent with a strong chemical odor. After the initial shock at Malancourt and Verdun, the Allies woke up. They realized that the German flamethrower wasn't immortal, and a secret order, not written in official documents. The German flamethrowers, initially considered elite, now found themselves carrying a death sentence. They became magnets for bullets. Imagine you are a young German soldier. You are recruited into the Guards Reserve. You wear the Totenkopf skull badge on your sleeve. You are proud. But when you step onto the moment you poked your head out of the trench, why? Because of hatred. British and French soldiers. If a German infantryman raised his hands in surrender, he might be spared. But if a flamethrower raised his hands in surrender, but the enemy on the other side of the trench. The early Klein Flammenwerfer machine was a hasty design by the mad, and worse was the technical problem. The pressure valves of they communicated almost entirely through hand signals. A slight wave of the hand, the entire formation halted. A pointed finger, the entire formation dispersed. Not a word was spoken. Boom! And barbed wire to die. The enemy didn't need to hit the fuel tank. They ignited themselves. And once the flames caught on their oil-soaked uniforms, nothing could extinguish them. 18. Human soul. 18. Their comrades, the regular infantrymen, one of the greatest tragedies, and a prime example of the failure of this weapon. A German flamethrower, a stream of fire erupted, incinerating the British Vickers machine gun. But a stray bullet, perhaps from a Canadian sniper, the bullet pierced the thin steel. Burning oil splattered in a 15-meter radius. It hit his two supporting comrades right behind him. It hit the German infantryman. Instead of clearing the way for the Germans, Hans had inadvertently the British, from a passive position, suddenly witnessed this event dealt a severe blow to the morale of the German army. They realized, after those humiliating defeats, they called these units by a sarcastic nickname, Himmelfahrtskommando, which translates to suicide. The average lifespan of a flamethrower on the battlefield. They had to change tactics. Instead of marching forward, they had to crawl. They had to use bomb craters but the price was still too high. To destroy an enemy bunker, the pride in the miracle weapon vanished. Instead, fear prevailed. Many German soldiers began to evade this mission. They would rather be imprisoned than carry. Australians believe in the human sense. The Germans unleashed their monster. And now, the British decided to raise their own. But the British, they wanted something capable. The man behind this insane he looked at the German flamethrower. Even the strange smell of fish sauce or soap in the wind. And so, in the secret workshops of London, the Livens Large Gallery Flame Projector was born. It wasn't a gun. It was a construction. Livens' goal was simple. No need for soldiers to run to the surface to spew flame, but how to get a 2.5-ton machine, as long as a train car. The answer lay in the miners' sappers. At the Somme front in 1916, hundreds of meters underground, a silent war was underway. British Royal Engineers were digging secret tunnels galleries toward the German lines. They worked in complete darkness. No noisy machinery was allowed. In that cramped, suffocating, oxygen-deprived space, they dismantled the Livens monster piece by piece. They transported each bolt, each oil pipe, each compressed air tank underground. Then they reassembled them right inside the tunnel. The regiment huddled in their trenches. A strange screeching. It was a feat of engineering and a logistical nightmare. The morning of July 1st, 1916. They spread out. They were silent. They watched the muzzle flash. The ground shook. Not from artillery. From a gaping hole, and then a gigantic column of fire appeared. It wasn't like the small sparks of the German soldiers. It was as big as a building. It spewed, not 20 meters, but 100 meters over 300 feet. The outcome was usual. Welcome to brutal World War. To understand why this weapon was created, we must go back in time. Imagine you're a German soldier defending a fortified concrete bunker. You're confident your machine gun can wipe out the British soldiers. And suddenly, the sky turns orange. The heat is so intense, even British soldiers 200 meters behind feel their eyebrows scorched. It engulfs the entire German first line of defense. It roasts the German soldier. No one escaped, because the rate of eruption was too fast. The sight was so terrifying. The British soldiers, who should have charged, were frozen in place. They stared in awe at the great hell unfolding before their eyes. The effectiveness of the Livens machine was absolute. Wherever it was used, the Germans either burned to death or surrendered instantly, and that day came. August 1966. However, this was a one-hit. Only 4 such machines were deployed at the Somme. 2 of them were destroyed by German artillery before they could fire. Only 2 were operational after the battle. No immediate reinforcements. 1917. World War I was entering its decisive phase. The Germans abandoning the cumbersome designs of the early war. German engineers, these were the Stoßtruppen, stormtroopers. Death. These soldiers didn't sit waiting in trenches. They attacked and imagine the scene in 1918. In the thick fog of mustard gas, the flame from the Wex, shorter, but more concentrated. It wiped out a bunker in just 3 seconds. The German soldiers no longer stood to observe the result. They spewed flames, and they ran. They turned the battle. The Wex became a symbol of new fear. But a shotgun, specifically a Winchester Model 1897. The American soldiers called it the trench broom. In just a few estimated troop strength between 1,500 and 2,500 men, the German flamethrower needed to. In the conventional American military thinking of the time when a light infantry company was surrounded by an enemy regiment equipped with heavy machine guns and recoilless rifles, there was only one outcome: complete annihilation. The result was a chain reaction explosion. A German flamethrower exploded right in his own trench, incinerating the entire stormtrooper squad. They had learned a hard. Germany was so terrified of the shotgun. When infantry carrying the Germans had the A7V tank, a clumsy mobile metal box. But the French. Imagine the horror of the German infantry in the final days of the war. Not a brief spark of infantry fire, but a continuous river of flames lasting for minutes. Fuel was pumped by. These tanks turned the bunkers into toaster ovens. No one could survive. No one could surrender. The temperature inside the bunker rose to 1,000 degrees Celsius. The air was sucked out. The weapons Germany had once proudly created now turned against them, crushing them on an industrial scale. It was the punishment of fate. November 1918. The gunfire ceased. Germany lost the war. Thousands of flamethrowers, but the fate of those who operated them was even more tragic. The soldier, in the eyes of the enemy, they carried with them a particular type of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that psychologists of the time couldn't. Many of the flamethrowers could never eat grilled meat again. They couldn't sit near a fireplace. They survived the war, but their souls had long been consumed by fire. Many of them committed suicide in the 1920s. They used guns. They used ropes. But no one chose self-immolation. The story of the flamethrower in World War I It taught humanity a costly lesson. We can build machines to kill each other more effectively. Flame guns continued to be used in World War II and Vietnam. When you see a flame, remember that it doesn't just bring war. Thank you for joining Brutal World War in this 4-part series on the most terrifying weapon in history. Cherish, I am Brutal World War. Goodbye, and see you again. It was a display of mathematics and absolute trust. The Australian infantrymen lay prone in the mud, listening to the shells whizzing over their heads and exploding right in front of them. They trusted their comrades at the artillery so much that they entrusted their lives to those coordinates. The artillery's wall of fire tore through the enemy's assault formation. It created a dead zone that no one could cross. For 3 hours, 108 Australian soldiers held out against 2,000 enemy troops, thanks to the perfect coordination between infantry and artillery. There was no panic. No one abandoned their position. By 6 p.m., Company D was almost out of ammunition. Each soldier had only a few rounds left. They prepared their bayonets. They knew death was approaching. The rain continued to pour. Darkness was falling. The American command at the air base ordered helicopters not to fly because of the terrible weather and intense enemy anti-aircraft fire. Too dangerous, they said. It's impossible to resupply. But 2 Royal Australian Air Force RAAF helicopter pilots, Flight Lieutenant Cliff Dole and Frank Riley, ignored the ban. They said, "Our brothers are dying down there." They flew so low that the treetops brushed against the belly of their aircraft. They flew directly over the enemy formation, dropping ammunition crates straight onto Company D's position. The crates fell into the mud. The Australian soldiers rushed out, breaking open the wooden crates with their rifle butts passing the soaking wet ammunition belts from hand to hand. That moment decided the battle. With new ammunition, Company D continued to hold its ground. And when Australian M113, Armored Personnel Carriers, APCs, arrived as reinforcements were arriving in the dead of night, they crushed the last vestiges of enemy resistance. The battle ended. 18 Australian soldiers killed, 24 wounded, but the price the enemy paid was truly shocking. The next morning, General Westmoreland of the U.S. flew to Mount Dat. He maintained his arrogant demeanor. He thought the Australians had exaggerated. How could 100 soldiers stop 2,000, he thought. Surely they only encountered a few scattered guerrilla groups. But when he and the American officers stepped onto the battlefield, they were silent. Over 245 enemy soldiers' bodies lay scattered throughout the rubber plantation. The actual estimated number could have been as high as 800 dead and wounded carried away by their comrades. The bodies of North Vietnamese main force soldiers, fully armed. The kill ratio was 1 to 15, even higher. Not from napalm bombs, not from B-52s, but from personal rifles and close-range artillery. After Long Tan, General Westmoreland famously exclaimed in a letter to Washington, "They won a battle that according to all military rules, they should have lost. The Australians don't fight like we do. They fight more effectively than we do." From then on, an unspoken directive spread through the ranks of the Liberation Army and the Viet Cong. Avoid direct combat with the Australians. If you clash, retreat and preserve your forces. Only fight when you are 100% certain of victory. This is a bitter but respectful acknowledgement. The Australians are no longer cowards or overly cautious. They are masters of defense. But the story doesn't end there. Long Tan only demonstrated the strength of the Australian regular infantry. In the shadows of the denser jungles, another Australian force was operating. A force whose presence was even more terrifying than an infantry battalion. These soldiers never left footprints. These soldiers were known as the Jungle Ghosts. There was a whispered saying among the guerrilla ranks in South Vietnam in the late 1960s. A survival principle passed from veteran to new recruit. It was simple, yet chilling. If you hear American helicopters' artillery fire shouts, you still have a chance to live. But if the jungle suddenly falls silent, then pray, because the ghosts are right behind you. Those ghosts weren't American soldiers. They were the elite soldiers of the Australian Army, the Royal Australian Special Forces, SASR. In Parts 1 and 2, we saw the Australian Regular Infantry shatter the preconceived notions of caution or cowardice held by American commanders with their historic victory at Long Tan. They proved that discipline and precision are more terrifying than blind fire. But for the SASR, war wasn't about large battles with thousands of soldiers. For them, war was the dark art of stealth. And it was this small group of soldiers who never called in artillery barrages, never launched noisy sweeps, who caused the enemy command to offer huge bounties just for the head of one of them. Why could a force patrolling with only 4 or 5 men cripple an entire enemy supply system in Phuoc Tuy province? Why was their kill rate the highest in the entire war? Welcome to the true nightmare of the jungle, the Age of Ghosts. The U.S. military also had Special Reconnaissance Forces, LRRP, Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol, or SEALs. They were brave and skilled fighters, but their thinking was still heavily influenced by the American war machine. If they encountered the enemy, they were ready to open fire call in bombers and make a spectacular helicopter retreat under fire. And the Australian SASR, their motto was "Leave no trace." ASASR. Patrol typically lasted 7 to 14 days deep inside enemy territory. The team consisted of only 4 or 5 men. No infantry, no armored vehicles. If detected, the chances of survival were virtually zero. Therefore, they took camouflage skills to an extreme level. The Americans marched to find the enemy. The Australians marched to become part of the jungle. Everything on an SAS soldier was designed to suppress sound and smell. They didn't eat hot food. They didn't use soap or toothpaste before missions because the guerrillas' hearing and sense of smell were so sensitive they could detect Western chemicals from a distance. The Australian soldiers let their bodies smell like mud and vegetation. When moving, they applied the jungle techniques mentioned in Part 1, but at a higher level. Sometimes it took them an hour to advance just 100 meters. Every step was calculated. If a branch broke, the entire formation would stand still, sometimes for half an hour. Their patience was beyond the imagination of the American soldiers. There are records of an Australian SASR team discovering a Viet Cong supply trail, instead of opening fire on the first group that passed. What did they do? They retreated into the bushes less than 5 meters from the trail. They sat there, not moving, not speaking, not defecating indiscriminately. They sat there for 3 days straight. They counted the number of people. They noted the insignia. They identified the weapons and the direction of movement. Enemy soldiers walked by, chatted, smoked, even stopped to rest just an arm's length from the Australians' guns, completely unaware that death was staring them in the face. The Americans wanted to eliminate an enemy squad immediately. The Australians wanted to know where that squad was going. Report the coordinates and call in artillery or bombers to obliterate the entire enemy base a few days later. Intelligence, not the number of dead bodies counted instantly, was the SASR's ultimate weapon. But don't think that the SASR only scouted. When they decided to pull the trigger, it was an unappealable death sentence. SASR patrols often employed hit and run, or shoot and scoot ambush tactics. Their preferred weapon was the shortened-barreled SLR-L1A1 for easier maneuverability in the jungle, sometimes fitted with an XM148 grenade launcher borrowed from the Americans. They carried incredibly powerful firepower for their 4-man squad, but only for a single moment. When an enemy patrol entered the ambush zone set up by the Australians, the outcome was usually over in less than 10 seconds. They opened fire simultaneously. Every shot was aimed precisely. The enemy fell before they could understand where the gunfire was coming from. The moment the enemy hit the ground, the SASR soldiers didn't stop to examine the corpses or collect spoils of war like regular infantry. They immediately broke formation, retreated and vanished into the deep forest along predetermined routes. The retreat was as silent and disciplined as their attack. When enemy reinforcements arrived a few minutes later to pursue, they found only the bodies of their comrades. No footprints, no discarded shell casings. The attackers had vanished like ghosts. This invisibility created immense psychological terror. An enemy battalion of hundreds with superior firepower was unable to move freely within its own operational area in Phuoc Tuai simply because of the fear of a group of 4 Australian soldiers pointing their guns from some bush. The effectiveness of these ghosts is demonstrated by the chilling numbers. During their time in the Vietnam War, 1966 to 1971, the Australian SASR conducted nearly 1,200 patrols. They killed hundreds. Some sources even estimate up to 500 confirmed enemy soldiers. So how many did they lose in direct combat? 1. That's right, only 1 Australian SASR soldier was directly killed by enemy fire during combat patrols. Several others died from accidents or mines, but in direct fire engagements, their casualty rate was almost 0. The kill/death ratio was estimated to be absurd, possibly over 400 to 1. This was the highest ratio of any special forces unit from any country that fought in Vietnam. The enemy wasn't stupid. They quickly recognized the threat from these black-faced, tiger-striped men. The Liberation Army Command had offered very high rewards for anyone who killed or captured an Australian SASR soldier or scout. There were even orders directing guerrilla units to track the Australians to find their secret base. But to hunt a ghost, you have to see the ghost. And that was almost impossible. Respect from the enemy is the clearest measure of an army's capability. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers who had bravely endured millions of tons of American bombs and bullets, who were ready to confront American tanks and helicopters head-on, had to order their troops to avoid unnecessary confrontations with Australians. Not because the Australians had superior weapons, but because the Australians played a deadly game that the American war machine could not understand, the game of patience. Now let's go back to 1966. Remember the arrogant remark of the American commander at headquarters in Saigon. They are too cautious. They lack decisiveness. Don't listen to those cowardly Australians. Historical truth is a harsh judge. Those so-called cowards firmly controlled the entire province of Phuoc Tuy, with a fraction of the manpower, a fraction of the budget, and a fraction of the casualties compared to their enormous American allies. General Westmoreland's noisy doctrine of attrition warfare plunged America into a quagmire. Burned villages and bombed hills only created new enemies. Meanwhile, the Australians' counterinsurgency tactics and absolute silence created a true safe zone, a place where the enemy trembled at the first sign of night. The Americans wanted to demonstrate their strength by tearing apart the jungle. The Australians conquered the jungle by blending into it. History is often written by the most flamboyant. That's why the world knows so much about Operation Rolling Thunder, about the San Pass, or the U.S. Marines, but forgets the men in blue-brimmed hats who taught the world's military superpower the most expensive lesson in the art of war. This was a hidden war, a stark truth that few textbooks mention. And this is Australia's hidden war. If you were chilled by the stories of the SASR ghosts or the Great Battle of Long Tan, leave a comment and let me know what secret you'd like us to uncover next in Australian military history. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any forgotten facts. I'm The Hidden Front. See you in the shadows of history.